Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable colleagues, I move that the Senate call on the Government of Canada to A, denounce the illegitimacy of the Cuban regime and recognize the Cuban opposition and civil society as valid interlocutors, and B, call on the Cuban regime to ensure the right of the Cuban people to protest peacefully without fear of reprisal and repudiation. I move this motion as part of the Transatlantic Parliamentary Forum, a global initiative with legislators in Europe and the Americas in solidarity with the struggle of the people of Cuba for the right to live in a democracy. Previous calls by freedom-loving Cuban Canadians to support those leading the peaceful struggle for human rights and democracy in Cuba thus far have been ignored by the Trudeau government, whose policy towards Cuba has been based on silence and, even more worrisome, inaction. I would like to highlight and recognize some Canadians of Cuban descent: Antonio Tang, Yanel Raul Nieves, Aime Calais Cabrera, Ramet Martinez Avila, Kirania Carbonal Diguez, Michael Lima, Manuel de Jesus Bunyan Roboredo, Ismari Bacalao, Andy Davila Miranda. All these are Canadians of Cuban descent who have come to this country and have built a great life for themselves and, of course, appreciate our freedom and democracy, but have not forgot to look back to their homeland, to their friends and their families who don't have the same privilege. Given the new reality that the world is living with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it is more important than ever that Canada supports unity among defenders of democracy at a global level in the face of accelerated expansion of authoritarian regimes around the world. Both the violence of the war against Ukraine and the repression unleashed by the Cuban regime against those who think differently show the lack of moral and rational arguments and dictatorial impotence of those who resort to force in order to win a war or to gain or hold onto power. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the world is entering a new era that requires a new strategic thinking to redefine international relations between democracies and autocracies. Canada should take a significant step in that direction by denouncing the illegitimacy of the Cuban regime, whose system and representatives have never been freely elected by the people. Instead of supporting and legitimizing the same Cuban regime that justifies the invasion of Ukraine with Kremlin propaganda, Canada should recognize the pro-democratic opposition in Canada as a valid interlocutor in our relationship with the island. Globally, Canada has lagged far behind its condemnation of the Cuban dictatorship. Instead, our current government continues with its policy of silence and inaction towards the repressive spiral that Cubans have experienced with particular brutality after the massive pro-democratic protests of July 2021. The Trudeau government continues to bet on shaking hands with Cuba's oppressors and engaging in behind-the-scenes diplomacy. It is time to raise our voices for all to hear. The silence and inaction of the Trudeau government, combined with the almost total lack of coverage by Canada's mainstream media, makes invisible the serious and systemic violations of human rights in Cuba and the repressive spiral that Cubans are experiencing, which, after the peaceful pro-democracy protests of July 11, has acquired an intensity and scale not seen in decades. By remaining silent in the face of this repression in Cuba, we are complicit, as Bishop and human rights activist Desmond Tutu said, and I quote, "If you're neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." After 63 years without holding free, fair, democratic, and multi-party elections, Cuba stands as one of the world's longest-lasting human rights predatory regimes. Since 1959, the current regime has persecuted, imprisoned, and marginalized human rights defenders, journalists, dissidents, artists, intellectuals, and critics. It is estimated that at least 500,000 Cubans have been arbitrarily arrested or imprisoned for political reasons in the past 6 decades. Cuba's one-party regime stifles freedom of expression and assembly by locking up people for their beliefs in opposition to the government, outlaws political pluralism, prohibits independent media, criminalizes dissent, and prevents the exercise of basic human rights and freedom. And things have worsened in the past 14 months as Cuban authorities have been responsible for serious and systemic human rights violations as part of a repressive policy that criminalizes peace protesters and imprisons and mistreats Cubans from all walks of life for simply expressing their views and exercising their freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. Human rights organizations have reported at least 10,000 repressive actions in Cuba from January 2021 to March 2022, including arbitrary detentions, imprisonment, forced house arrests, fines, shame trials, acts of repudiation, character assassination campaigns, beatings, internet cuts, forced expatriations to harass and intimidate human rights defender critics, independent activists, artists, journalists. Colleagues, by the end of 2021, the Cuban regime has arbitrarily arrested 2,717 people, forced 3,743 to house arrest, and carried out 60 acts of repudiation against pro-democracy activists. These acts are fascist by nature and constitute the greatest expression of intolerance and extremism promoted by the Cuban regime against those who think differently. On July 11, 2021, more than 187,000 Cubans took to the streets in 45 Cuban cities in historic demonstrations to protest long-standing restrictions on human rights, and they were simply shouting, "Freedom, down with dictatorship," and demanding democratic change as a solution to the country's deep economic and health crisis. The Cuban regime responded to the peaceful protests with extreme brutality and violence, with the massive deployment of special brigades and police in cities across Cuba, levels of surveillance, arbitrary arrests, persecution, and repression in Cuba reached levels unprecedented in 20 years, according to Amnesty International. Security forces responded to the pro-democratic protests with extreme violence and opened fire on protesters. They used tear gas and beat protesters with batons. Those who were arrested were subjected to tortures, cruel, degrading, and inhumane treatment. Following these acts of brutality, Cuba surpassed Venezuela, Nicaragua, Russia, and even Iran in the number of political prisoners. As of March 2022, the political imprisonment in Cuba constitutes the greatest human drama experienced by Cuban families today. And worse still, these victims of repression in Cuba, the political prisoners report the use of torture as well as cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment in prisons, including solitary confinement, excessive use of shackles, beatings, verbal humiliation, act of repudiation, and the threat of rape, denial of medical attention and family visits. Accounts of these methods of repression have been documented in letters and verbal reports sent by prisoners to their friends and families. Today, I raise my voice and encourage all of you to join me in denouncing the condition of political prisoners in Cuba subject to torture, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. I want to take a moment to highlight the cases of some of these people. For instance, artist and activist Miquel Osorbo, winner of the Grammy Award for the song Patria y Vida, Fatherland and Life, has been incarcerated since May 2021 in a maximum security prison of Pinar del Rio. He's currently suffering from lymph nodes issues and has not been offered an adequate diagnosis or medical treatment for his condition. Then there is Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara, a leading figure in the San Isidoro movement and one of Time's 100 influential people in 2021, was arrested on his way to a demonstration in Havana on July 11th and transferred without a court hearing to a maximum security prison. He has led numerous hunger strikes and protests for his unjust imprisonment that have left him in poor health. Felix Navarro and his daughter, Celie Navarro, coordinators of the Pedro Luis Boitel Movement for Democracy, were recently sentenced to 9 and 8 years in prison respectively, not for demonstrating, but for simply asking police about the status of some of the members of their organization that were detained on July 11th. I'm particularly concerned about the vulnerable groups that were victims of the repression stemming from the July protests. 33 children, minors at the time of their detention, were criminally prosecuted with half of them facing charges of sedition. According to Article 100A of the Cuban Penal Code, the charge of sedition carries penalties of 10, 20 years in prison or death penalty. There are at least 130 women who are political prisoners in Cuba. Furthermore, all the mothers of the July 11th pro-democracy protesters are being regularly threatened by state security with imprisonment if they denounce the cases of their children at an international level. I also want to take this opportunity to condemn the hundreds of trials that have been conducted in Cuba against peaceful democratic protesters in violation of due process and Article 7E of the Roman Statute of the International Criminal Court. Pro-democracy protesters are also charged with articles of the Cuban Criminal Code, such as sedition, public disorder, and insulting public officials that violate international human rights standards, as they are legal disguise to muzzle free expression and freedom of association. Without any due process, most protesters whose average age is 34 years old are being sentenced to prison terms ranging from 5, 10, and even 30 years, colleagues, in prison for simply recording a protest or a peaceful demonstration. I ask, what has Justin Trudeau's government done in the face of these atrocious human rights violations in Cuba over the past year? The Trudeau government has only made a few vague comments on July 11th, 2021 protests, mainly in response to questions from media. Unlike when they had condemned other dictatorships around the world, such as Venezuela, Belarus, these comments were not even official government statements published on the Government of Canada websites. As a matter of fact, our Prime Minister made these comments mainly in response to pressure from the Conservative opposition party in the House. While we were quick to express solidarity with the people following the July protests, the Trudeau government merely repeats that it is aware of the situation in Cuba, but their concerns are never coupled with any action. The initiative of the Trudeau government, published in the November 16, 2016 fact sheet, Strengthening Canada-Cuban Relations, and I quote, strengthening Canada-Cuban relations. That's our government's position, to accompany the Cuban regime in a supposed modernization of its system and in a collaborative projects with a view to fostering inclusive and accountable governance through exchange with Cuba has been a catastrophic failure. The Cuban regime has not been accountable to its people since it came to power because it was never elected in free elections, and Cuba lacks any form of separation of powers that are so customary to us. It responds to peaceful protests with brutal repression, as seen on July 11, 2021, when the unelected president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, appeared on television giving a combat order against peaceful protesters. Cuba today has more repressive laws than ever before in its recent history. Some recent examples in the Cuban legal framework corroborate this statement. In August 2021, the official Gazette published Decree Laws 35 and 42 that criminalized the independent press and critics of the regime, to Regulation 102 that punishes the so-called dissemination of information considered false and detrimental to public order. More recently, the draft bill for a new penal code criminalizes all civil and political liberties protected by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, including the right to free speech, free assembly, and peaceful protest, among other with articles that violate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I would be remiss in my remarks today if I didn't also commit to raising awareness among my fellow Canadians about the moral and ethical implications of spending our money in Cuba, which is a beautiful island, one of the most beautiful in the world, but is governed by a political regime that preys on the people and it preys on their rights. Vacationing and investing in Cuba is tantamount to being active accomplices in financing the military conglomerate that operates hotels, financial institutions, and the tourist industry. With that money, we help as Canadians sustain in Cuba what global firepower considers the fourth largest military in the world. In other words, Canadian money in Cuba does not contribute to improving the lives of citizens, but it is used by the regime to monitor, persecute, repress journalists, human rights activists, and critics. In the current global context, Vacationing and investing in Cuba is tantamount to giving support to a regime that uses all its state-controlled media to reproduce the Kremlin's disinformation machine on the invasion of Ukraine. In doing so, we're helping the Cuban regime in its role as active participant in a hybrid warfare that, through its disinformation, fabricates narratives that help justify Putin's invasion of Ukraine and contribute to covering up the Russian regime's responsibility for the perpetration of heinous war crimes against children and civilian population. Canada cannot forget that countries such as Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua are involved in the axis of aggression against Ukraine. Canada's leadership in supporting the cause of human rights and democracy in Cuba is vital more than ever before. In a world where the global growth of authoritarian regimes is the greatest challenge of our time, colleagues, I urge all of you to stand on the right side of history and set a historic precedent in Canada by passing this motion in solidarity with the people of Cuba who aspire to live in free, democratic, and an inclusive nation, things that we take for granted, that they haven't tasted in 6 decades. Canada cannot continue to launder the image of the Cuban dictatorship. It is morally questionable that we continue to vacation and invest in Cuba while ignoring the fact that regime on that island is the largest jailer in the Americas, with over 1,000 political prisoners dying in those prisons. Cuba today is experiencing a unique historical moment because, of the first time in more than 6 decades, a new generation of young people have started to demand their rights in public in a peaceful way, but in a steadfast way. This nascent culture of democratic rebellion requires international support and solidarity to be successful. The people of Cuba, the mothers of the hundreds of political prisoners, the defenseless population who are crying out for international help and solidarity. Canada must listen to the spontaneous and legitimate voices of these Cuban people, expressed in towns and cities all over that beautiful country on July 11th, 2021. Their peaceful demonstrations sent a loud and clear message to the illegitimate regime that is imposing itself in power that their time is over. Canada, as it has done against 21 other authoritarian regimes around the world, should impose sanctions on all the individuals within the Cuban regime responsible for the persecution, beatings, and torture of the July 11th demonstrators, and all those who on that and other dates have peacefully raised their voice for democracy in Cuba. That is why I call on all of you to stand on the side of the Cuban people, not the Cuban regime, to stand on the side of freedom, to stand on the side of democracy, to stand on the side of human rights. This is what this institution, I think, holds dear, what Canadians hold dear, and I think it's important that we stand and make sure that they know that we are listening, we are watching, we are hearing, we're going to be by them. I thank you, colleagues. Long live a free Cuba. Patria y vida. Thank you very much.